Welcome back to Writers Read. And I like saying welcome back to Writers Read because this has been going on for a few years, as a matter of fact. And so we have many writers who have read in the past. We have two new writers reading tonight. We have John Wilson and George Counts. And we'll look forward to their reading on a Monday night, 370 at 7 p.m. Writers Read program. So keep your calendars available for that time. Monday night, 7 o'clock on 370. So we have also made a decision to have two readers, which means we can just relax a little bit and not have a red card that say you have to stop reading. So let's get started here with Paul's poem. I'm counting on the audience to respond. I say a line and you say a line. Write, write, write.
Write, write, write.
Until you get it right.
Until you get it right.
Then read aloud.
Then read aloud.
You'll draw a crowd.
You'll draw a crowd.
And bring them great delight.
And bring them great delight.
Before we started this session, I gave some thought to the writing process. And I decided it would be wonderful if the writers would share just an idea, just a part of their writing process with us before they read. And so I sent them some ideas. I said, do you write every day? Do you edit your writing? What is your process for your writing? And so I'm going to ask John, before he reads, to just share one idea about his writing process. John?
I write most days, not necessarily on the same thing. Sometimes I'm writing on a particular work. Other times a different idea has come up and I want to put words into the computer while I'm thinking of them. Sometimes I go back and reread, edit what I've written because I write from a beginning towards an end with an outline of maybe what happens in each chapter.
Okay.
But really, it's unfolding on the screen before me, rather like when you read a book that I don't know what's going to happen until the characters actually do it.
Oh, the characters actually do it. That is great, John. So you work from an outline.
I make an outline of, I don't know, 30, 40, 50 chapters, whatever it seems right, having envisioned characters in a situation as a brief few-word description, and then expand on that, trying to create the characters in reality, what they might look like or sound like, or what's their motivation, what's their problem that they're confronting. But mostly I write activity through dialogue as much as possible and only a little bit of description. I let the characters tell the story.
And let the characters tell their story. And you might have picked up by now that John is a novelist. He writes novels, so that his process might be very different than somebody who's writing a memoir or a family history. So thank you for sharing that, John. Let's hear your read today.
Okay, I'm going to read today from the book I just published this week, Water Flows Over the Mountain. It's the fifth of my novels, so we'll start with chapter 1. Crisis Hits Home. What are you saying? This cannot be true. It just can't, exclaimed Elizabeth Cassandra Devlin, Lady Selby, her blue eyes opening wide. It's not possible. Utterly confused, all she could do for the moment was stare blindly into space. The charms of the blue salon were completely lost to her for the moment, even if it was her favorite room in Selby House. Rather uncomfortable in performing his duty, the distinguished Mr. Oliver Templeton gestured with his hands, attempting to placate the storm. Elizabeth appeared just lovely in a delightful white, pink, and morning dress, adorned only by a pearl necklace with matching earrings and a modest wig. Except, of course, her features were upset by the disturbing news he had felt compelled to convey. Not quite sure how to proceed, he temporized. "Regrettably, certainly, my lady, but quite true nonetheless, I'm distressed to say." "Why, it's just preposterous," Elizabeth responded, "and too confusing to be readily understood. Not sedentary by nature, it was impossible for the 25-year-old woman to comprehend this monstrosity sitting down, without even being aware of it. She rose to stride across her salon and stare out the window. She looked onto St. James Square, though not seeing any of it. Shaking her head, she turned and strode back to stare into the fire. That gave her some comfort in the chilly March air of 1765. Abruptly, she turned to confront her barrister. "You mean to tell me that I'm ruined, completely done in?" she demanded, with all of the august demeanor her 5'2" provided. Ever the gentleman, Mr. Templeton had risen from the Louis XV chair. His 56 years made his movements noticeably slower than his hostess. After adjusting the elegant lace cuffs of his blue silk coat, he raised both hands in restraint to support his reply. No, it's not quite as bad as that." Then, qualifying himself, he continued, "Or at least not yet, certainly not just yet. But you absolutely must practice moderation, my lady. Economize. You have been most extravagant these past years since your father's untimely death, and—" "Ha!" Elizabeth cut in. "My father dropped more in a night at White's than I spend in a month." She rose and strode across the window again to stare out at the London street scene. Fury just bubbled up in her. "Well, on occasion that may have been true," the barrister replied. "Much of his losses were, well—" Elizabeth glanced back at Mr. Templeton as he struggled to describe the late Earl without offending. She appreciated his tact and sympathized with his difficulty. "Deep," she added. "The 7th Earl of Accrington was notorious throughout London for his wagers." Voicing this fact vented enough of her energy. She was now able to confront the problem. Besides, there was no reason to make Mr. Templeton uncomfortable over something which was hardly his fault. Turning, Elizabeth pulled the bell cord, then returned to her seat. She settled the pale yellow folds of her morning dress about her neat figure and gestured to the barrister to be seated as again. Owens, her elderly butler, opened the double oak doors almost immediately. He was resplendent in the shelby yellow livery of maroon coat with an extensive gold braid and buttons and dark blue knee pants. White silk stockings and black shoes with gold buckles completed his ensemble. "Would you care for some tea, or would a touch of claret be more suitable?" she inquired of her guest. "Tea would be excellent, my lady, thank you," Templeton replied, setting aside his own tastes in deference to his young hostess and leaning back into his comfortable chair. His young client faced a terrible dilemma, not really of her own fault and making, he well knew. The sole surviving child, her mother having died when Elizabeth was only 12, and an inattentive father who had now passed on as well. With no one to properly guide her, she had grown up quite naturally spoiled and self-indulgent. As a result, she was very resistant to surrendering her independence to any suitor, no matter how worthy the gentleman might be. Just how to advise her now was a quandary. Elizabeth raised her eyes to Owen, catching his bow of acknowledgement to withdraw before continuing. I'm sorry I'm so bubble-headed over this tangle. Now please, try again to explain it to me. Somewhat reassured, Mr. Templeton leaned forward to emphasize the importance of his words. Very well, my lady. The long and the short of it is that when your father died, his debts came to some £87,000. Most of his estate was entailed with the Earldom of Accrington. You, as his only surviving child, were left with just the barony of Selby and the lands entailed with it. Seeing that his patron accepted this, he continued. That provides you with an income of, let's say, just over £9,000. But you've been spending more than 11 each year. Your father's been dead more than 3 years now with you as sole heir, yet none of the debt has been paid. In fact, it's grown. Your creditors are, well, concerned. Now that's the blunt truth, in a nutshell, so to say. A vision of the magnificent ball gown delivered by Miss Pauline only last week, for nearly 60 guineas, sprang readily to Elizabeth's mind. Then there was the delightful blue morning dress she had just ordered. But why wasn't I told, she demanded. Mr. Templeton pulled at his earlobe a moment, a trifle embarrassed. Well, my lady, you see, Mr. Dorset, as the senior partner, always handled your father's affairs, and then after his death, yours. A kindly man, much older than Mr. Templeton, Elizabeth had known Mr. Dorset most of her life. Yes, I'm well aware of that. In fact, I was surprised to have you call on me today instead of him. Mr. Templeton nodded as he continued. As it happens, Mr. Dorset hasn't been well for, all winter, I suppose. I believe he tried to indicate the nature of your situation at his last visit with you in October, I believe. She thought a moment, frowning in puzzlement. He did caution me on the stakes commonly wagered at Lady Clairmouth, which I'd mentioned attending, but he certainly said nothing as shocking as what you've imparted. Well, yes, I was afraid that was the case. He confided that he wasn't at all sure how to convey the gravity of your circumstances in terms sufficiently clear and delicate. Elizabeth blinked. He was so delicate I never felt the point. Yes, I inferred as much, and under the circumstances, even with Mr. Dorset laid up for a few weeks, I felt you must be appraised of the true facts. It is our duty, after all. His eyes downcast, Elizabeth replied in low tones, I appreciate your consideration. Even as she uttered the words, her thoughts raced through her predicament. Lord, she owed more than 10 years' total income. Oh, Father, how could you? How in the world am I to escape such a coil? Would everything have to be foregone? Owens returned with a large silver tray. Moving sedately, he served each of them with a delicate china cup and saucer. His glance towards his mistress elicited no response. However, he interpreted his duty as complete and departed, leaving the tray. Abruptly, Elizabeth sipped her tea, then looked up at Mr. Templeton over her cup. So what happens now? Well, that depends, of course. Several things you might do. Important thing is to economize. Get your expenses down so some of the income can be used to retire the debt. But that will take years. Well, yes, likely will. And then there's the interest. Interest? How much is that? Well, it depends. Not the same on each note, but it comes to, setting down his saucer, he drew a paper from his inside pocket, stretched it out at arm's length to peer at it. Around $3,000 a year. You mean I would have only $6,000 to live on after paying the interest? Well, I could never pay off the principal, Mr. Templeton put in. Well, it does look difficult. Elizabeth forbore expressing how it looked to her. Hopeless. Her eyes fell to the floor, then she asked, "Does that mean selling out? But I can't, can I?" "No, or at least not totally. Your father's earldom of Accrington with that revenue is now passed to the next male heir, as those lands are entailed. Of course, there are a few things not included with the earldom, but are entailed with the barony, and thus to you, as heiress to the Baron of Selby. This townhouse and the Selby Manor, of course, plus the Old Thorn Castle. The Larksfield Country House and the Lincolnshire Hunting Lodge are not entailed to either estate and fall to you as your father's heir." "Well, at least I retain the two most enjoyable houses of all the properties," she muttered to herself, and then sipped her tea before asking, "And just why are my father's debts passed to me when that most valuable properties are handed off to that odious mushroom, Mr. Geoffrey Tobias Teasdale, and becoming the 8th Earl of Accrington, Viscount of Dunham? Oh, it just makes me nauseous. And his tedious wife, Sarabella, she is just too... My lady, it's all in accordance with the patent of nobility as issued by King James VI, 12th in 1612. I fear you know that all too well," Mr. Templeton reminded her. "As it happens, though, you are the 24th to hold the barony of Selby. That by courtesy of King Henry VIII, granting those rights to Elaine, surviving daughter of the 14th Baron, on marriage to your ancestor, Richard Devlin, to become the 15th, a most unusual allowance in letting a title descend through the female line, which you also well know. Unfortunately, responsibility for your father's debt passed to you as his nearest blood descendant, rather than with the title of his earldom and the estates thereto." Yes, I was told all of that," Elizabeth replied, rather digested. "So when do I go to debtor's prison?" "Oh, now, it hasn't come to that. Not by a long shot," was an appalling thought. "No one has even suggested such a thing, I assure you." Then, as he reflected on the possibility, playing with his cup before he continued, "No denying someone could file debtor charges, but, well, hardly think it likely. Anyway, you could always escape prison." She looked up at him. "Marriage, you know. Husband is always responsible for his wife's debts." A ludicrous idea, she had to laugh at it. "I'm sure there's many a fine gentleman eager to marry me just so he can go to debtor's prison in my place." "Well, didn't mean it quite that way," Templeton hastened to explain. "But there's more than one gentleman around with a plump purse who'd cover your debts quicker than the cat took up the mouse, if you'd have him." "Gentlemen? Ha! You mean knobs sprouting like weeds among the garden walks," she decried. Still, she conceded to herself it might be possible. But even if some proverbial savior appeared, marriage to such a person? It was almost unthinkable. To sign over all property rights and freedom to become the chattel of some low-bred common husband, what a revolting prospect. After enjoying 3 years of real independence following her father's death, essentially so for the last 5 years, she had little taste to relinquish such advantages under any threat, especially one that had yet to materialize. She set her cup back down. "Of course, your creditors may never initiate any unpleasant action," Mr. Templeton added. "Not likely to. Most of the debts would be deuced awkward to collect through the courts against a woman. The majority of them are gambling debts, held by only a couple of your father's old friends." Well, that prospect aroused her attention. "Who?" "Mostly Lord Gladstone, while though Sir Roger Ardsley holds a fair amount too, 1 or 2 others with lesser amounts. 2 of the Earl's closest cronies, Neither was a stranger to her. Lord Mudstone would never miss his, even if it was the whole 90-odd thousand. But Sir Roger now, that was a different matter. Somehow she felt his finances were little better than hers, and yet his attentiveness had become most marked lately, an ominous portent in light of Mr. Templeton's comment on marriage. Sir Roger was a widower, nearly twice her age, and possessing a most dissolute reputation. But the barrister interrupted her thoughts to continue. It's the trade folks who've been the most pressing, like you'd expect. Gentlemen understand these things. Elizabeth considered a moment, then asked, so how much is needed to satisfy them? Again, Mr. Templeton gestured vaguely. The important thing is that they see meaningful progress towards eventual repayment. The amount isn't really important. And that amount, say 1,000 now, and a regular maybe 100 a month or thereabouts would probably suffice. It seemed a trifling sum, yet Elizabeth suspicioned it was not. Where can I get that 1,000, though? Only by selling something, I suppose, she considered out loud. I wonder what? Well, I'm sure there's any number of things. Yes, no doubt, she snapped. But the result was giving up something, maybe several things she likely wanted, enjoyed, and was accustomed to having as a matter of course. Her irritation at the reduction in her circumstances was readily apparent. Mr. Templeton wisely decided that enough had been said for the moment. He set his cup down, only half emptied. There is certainly no need to make final decisions today. This entire matter is undoubtedly shocking, and although it will not go away, a day or two thought may put everything in better perspective. He rose. Let me call again later this week and we'll discuss everything further. Elizabeth made no effort to detain him, but extended her thanks for all his consideration. In a moment, Owens appeared, conducted the gentleman out, leaving Elizabeth alone with her thoughts. Chapter 2. At home in Selby House. With no one to intrude on her deliberations, Elizabeth leaned back to rest her heavy hairpiece against the solid wood frame of the furniture. Accustomed to a rather unfettered life of luxury since birth, she was now forced to contemplate a drastic reduction of her living style. Not that the experience was unique, as she well knew. Several notable, even exemplary families of her acquaintance had suffered severe reversal of fortune in recent years, what with the war and the economic problems. But the prospect of it occurring to her had never even remotely suggested itself. It was enough to make one physically ill. She could vividly see the pitying looks exchanged by her friends and acquaintances, their whispered explanations, poorly concealed behind their fans. And oh gad, the silky consenting words, mouthed oh so gloatingly. Oh God, how could one endure the humiliation? She'd never be able to present herself before society in the face of such reaction. And the grinding life ever after? Not even life, existence. No pleasures to look forward to. Dressing and clothing styles discarded ages ago. Styles? Ha! What semblance of style did she dream was possessed by outdated rags? It was easy to see why disastrous problems drove people to suicide. Her eyes wandered around the blue salon with the splendid cove ceiling and the Baroque verge decoration. Everyone agreed that Selby House was one of the finest creations by the Venetian architect. She just loved the house, and especially this blue salon. The room had been remodeled at her direction soon after she had returned from her European tour. white marble moldings with just a hint of black inlay, neatly outlined the blue damask covering the walls, perhaps a dozen gilded frames, and an excellent collection of mostly Van Dycks, while the furnishings were hempel white and a severely simple Persian carpet. Yet it was the single marvelous cut crystal chandelier she had selected in Venice that dominated the room and made it really remarkable. Elizabeth had always found the result warm and comfortable. Standing up, she listlessly walked across the floor before turning slowly. Her eyes fell on the forte piano occupying the corner. She wandered over to stroke the gleaming wood of the lovely instrument. She raised the cover and touched a key, middle C. Then the keys to form a chord. With a sigh, she pulled back the bench and seated herself. Without any real thought, she began to play Scarlatti's Sonata in F minor. It was a piece that always seemed comforting to her and not too difficult. Opening of the doors distracted Elizabeth from her reverie as Mrs. Bartlett entered. The 52-year-old widow was one of her father's less affluent cousins. The Earl had installed Jane Bartlett at his country seat, Accrington Court, some 11 years earlier, soon after his wife's death, to chaperone and assist in raising Elizabeth in a proper English style, supplementing her French governess, Madame Claire Devereux. So satisfactory had the relationship developed that when the young lady Elizabeth Devlin came to join London society at the age of 17 under the sponsorship of her father's sister, Lady Caroline Colchester, Mrs. Bartlett had come too as her companion. "Hope my interruption is not too distracting," she said, cocking one eye appraisingly at her young mistress. Then added, "So the sky has finally fallen, has it? Am I about done?"
That would be a good place to stop.
Okay.
Perhaps. Although I would love to hear the Scarlatti, let me just say that much. And we'll have to look forward to reading this book in our library. John's first book was Lost at Sea, and it is going to be on the book collection of books by us and about us on the windowsill. Tell me the title of this book again.
Water Flows Over the Mountain.
Water Flows Over the Mountain.
It's available on Kindle, as all 5 of my books are. It's not yet available in print.
Okay, so it's available on Kindle as we speak.
Yes, so is
God.
Lost at Sea.
Yeah.
And the other 3 books are a trilogy, starting with A Prince Comes from Wyoming.
Well, thank you so much, John. And it was wonderful to watch you read your writing and anticipate the word choice that you made. It was really wonderful. Thank you so much, John. Okay, and now we welcome George Counts. And George, I do get to say a public thank you for the hours and hours and hours you've given our community and kept us safe. Thank you so much. And just a word about your process. I know that you're going to read something very different than a novel. Tell us, what do? Do you work on a computer? Do you write every day? How does it work for you?
Well, this was a one-time special piece that I wrote, and I did it over several days, several weeks, working with an advisor as well.
Oh, okay.
Yes. So I would do a draft and review it with my advisor.
With your advisor.
Right. It came about because my late wife Ann and I took courses almost every quarter.
Oh my.
And one of the courses that we took up at the Lifetime Learning Center up in Lake City was on American history. And during that course, the subject of school integration came up. And I mentioned that I had been a part of integrating a school. So a couple of my colleagues and the teacher suggested that I write it down.
Absolutely.
I had never thought about writing anything about my past because I didn't particularly feel that it was unique. But in thinking about this, it occurred to me that my two sons, who are in their early 60s, and my two granddaughters, who are in their mid-30s, had no idea of what I had gone through as a young person, a kid. So I decided to expand it into, instead of just focusing on the integration piece, to focus on other aspects of my life growing up, specifically for my kids and grandkids.
Oh.
So that led to this memoir.
Right to it, and it'll
Yes.
be a gift to them, George.
Yes.
It is a gift to them.
They were astonished.
Yeah.
My granddaughters just couldn't imagine life as it was during the Depression. This was 50 years before they were born. It was like a foreign land to them.
Absolutely, another planet almost. Thank you for coming to read today, George. I'm looking forward.
This wondrous adventure, the journey of a sharecropper's son. Childhood memories, 1935 to 1947. I was born June 14, 1935, at home in Idabel, Oklahoma, attended by a midwife. Idabel is in a rural area in the extreme southeast corner of the state, a place where during the Depression, African American men and women tried to support themselves growing cotton and other crops. My mother and father worked as sharecroppers on a cotton farm where we lived as tenants. When I was around 6 or 7 years old, they fashioned a bag for me out of a feed sack with a strap that ran over my shoulder so that I could walk along with them and pick cotton. The bag and the cotton were almost as tall as I was. Our house was raised on stones or bricks so that it would be above any flooding. A stream ran by in front of the house with a couple of planks leading from the house to the unpaved road. My mother, father, paternal grandmother, and I lived in the house. My older half-brother lived with other relatives, so that I was raised essentially as an only child. There was no indoor toilet or running water, but there must have been an electrical source, because I distinctly remember lying on the floor on Sunday nights listening to the scary squeaking of a closing door on the Shadow Knows on the radio. I will never forget the time my parents were working in the fields, leaving me in the care of my grandmother, and I did something bad, angering her. She cut a switch to give me a whipping. I ran out of the house and made a game of running around it, looking underneath the floorboards to see where she was, then running the other way. She gave up and eventually went back inside. I continued playing outside and eventually forgot that she was looking for me. But Grandma was waiting for me. She jumped out from behind the door and gave me a double whipping with the switch because I had run away the first time. In the fall, my father and one or more of the other farmers would butcher a hog to put away meat for the winter. On that day, I would get a sharpened stick and wait for them to hang up the carcass, cut it open, and hack off a small piece of liver, which I would put on my stick and cook over an open fire. It would sometimes fall off into the ashes, but I would dig it out and put it back on the stick until it was done. I had a real love of liver and onions throughout my childhood. My school day started with a long walk to a one-room school for black children. I remember our teacher, Mrs. Smith. World War II started when I was 6. We had no newspapers, so I must have heard about it on the radio. I was fascinated by the war talk about airplanes and vividly recall huddling behind my open textbook at the back of the class and drawing airplanes. Miss Smith caught me and gave me a scolding for not paying attention to my lessons. During the war, my mother went to Bakersfield, California to live with her sister, Eva, and work in the factories. I don't remember how long she was gone. It could have been several months or a year or more. My father worked the farm by himself. My grandmother had the main responsibility for raising me and instilling values such as respect for one's elders, truth, and honesty. My uncle got a job as a Pullman porter in Oklahoma City. As a little kid, I knew he was important when he took me to see a train for the first time. I recall him dressed in a spiffy uniform and cap, holding me by the hand as we walked up to a scary, massive iron machine that belched steam. A major change occurred in 1945 when the family moved to Oklahoma City to find better jobs. My father worked as a laborer in a meatpacking plant, though I am convinced he never gave up his dream of being an independent farmer. My mother worked as a domestic for several white families. We got a house near the elementary school where I started the 5th grade. Nearby were a library, a YMCA, and a drugstore. The librarian and the drugstore owners were white. In the summer, I would go to the library and check out one book. I was only allowed one at a time. Then I would sit on my porch and read as long as there was light. When I finished that book, I would go back for another. The librarian seemed not to believe that a young black kid could read and understand such a big book as The Count of Monte Cristo. So she demanded that I tell her all about it. I was very proud to be able to do so. Black people were confined mostly to the northeast quadrant of Oklahoma City, but our community had stores, 2 movie theaters, nightclubs, churches, several elementary schools, and 1 junior-senior high school. There were also 2 physicians and 2 dentists. We had everything I thought I could want, including close-knit families who watched over each other's children. It was a happy childhood. For us kids, it was a safe world, albeit racially segregated. My only contact with whites occurred during a citywide meeting of high school student leaders that I attended as a senior. Blacks could also go to the segregated movie theaters in the city, but had to use an outside stairway to get to the balcony. At Page Elementary School, where I went for grades 5 and 6, I was chosen to recite the Gettysburg Address. I remember being practically pushed out from backstage with my head down. But I made my parents proud by getting through the piece quickly and without mistakes. Douglas Junior-Senior High School, Memories of Adolescence, 1947 to 1953. When I went to Douglas, I often stayed with my aunt, whose house was only about 2 blocks from the school. I took a course in wood shop and made a small cedar chest about 8 by 6 by 4 inches. In the top, I carved the letter M for mother and for my mother's first name, Mary. I had forgotten all about the chest, but in the late 80s or early 90s, when my brother and I visited my mother in Oklahoma City for a Thanksgiving family reunion, I learned that she had kept it all those years. After she died in 1997, I honored her by burying the chest and a few other treasures on Assateague Island off the coast of Virginia. A favorite teacher of mine was Miss Edwards, who taught us English. She was passionate about what we needed to know and do as black persons in order to succeed in the white world. One of her main points was for us to be able to communicate, to speak properly and write clearly. I can still see her diagramming sentences or dabbing the tears in her eyes when we recited one of her favorite poems from memory. I loved being in the school band, especially the parades and concerts. I may not have been big enough, strong enough, or brave enough to be an athlete, to go on trips and be admired by the girls. But I wore a uniform and traveled with the band when the football team went to out-of-town games. This was the next best thing to being an athlete. I also became the sports editor for the school paper. The Boy Scouts also helped me grow in confidence. I loved the organization and became an Eagle Scout at the young age of 14, reportedly the first black Eagle Scout in the state of Oklahoma, and was even mentioned in the Oklahoma City Daily newspaper. In the spring of 1950, church and family members and others raised enough money to pay for me to attend the Boy Scout Jamboree in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. My family drove me to Dallas, where scouts from all over the Southwest boarded the trains to the Jamboree. It was my first train trip, taking us to St. Louis, Washington, D.C., New York City, and finally to Valley Forge. About 47,000 scouts from around the country attended. I heard both President Truman and General Eisenhower speak. We also took a day trip to Philadelphia before the Jamboree ended. The Jamboree was by far the most memorable experience of my youth, giving me a chance to see a bigger world beyond the confines of our black community in Oklahoma City. By 1952, young men who were veterans of the Korean War returned to our high school to complete their education. They were 19 or 20 years old or older, and we looked up to them. They had been exposed to many things that the rest of us had not seen or done. University of Oklahoma, Challenges of a Greater World, 1953 to 1960. During the mid-40s and early 50s, agitation to integrate the schools in Oklahoma increased. The University of Oklahoma Board of Regents had resisted integrating the colleges because it felt that the state was doing enough for black people by supporting a black college, Langston University. Ultimately, a lawsuit was filed seeking to integrate the law school, and another effort was made to integrate the graduate school. The push to integrate the college of the university was led by our black leaders, our teachers, and our parents. One student from my high school had already been admitted to OU in the fall of 1952 as a pharmacy major. Another black student from Ponca City, Oklahoma, had been enrolled for a brief time during that year. In the summer of 1953, I was one of 3 boys, along with 1 girl, selected by our local leaders to enroll at OU. Parents had to be willing to allow their kids to attend and to pay tuition and other school expenses. Our teachers helped us identify majors in subjects not taught at Langston, because only if Langston did not offer our majors were we permitted to attend OU. Mine was to be chemical engineering. I had taken a course in chemistry, but I knew absolutely nothing about engineering. We were assigned to dormitories on the campus, but had to have black roommates. The girl, Jessie Thomas, lived alone that first year. But I lived with a junior transfer student, a piano major. I loved music, and playing a baritone horn, successfully auditioned for the OU marching band. My greatest satisfactions that first year were with the band. Going to Dallas for the OU Texas football game, and to the Orange Bowl in Miami, and hanging out with my roommate in the music practice rooms. I did not do well that first semester in the math and pre-engineering courses. My advisor was aloof and never seemed to have time to help me. At our only meeting, after looking over my high school record, he said, quote, "You seem to be a smart boy and should be able to do the work." He assigned me more of the same courses. Meeting with him was one of my first one-on-one encounters with a white person in authority. I never realized that I could ask for another advisor. At the end of the first year, I was adrift and failing academically. I had been one of the top students in my high school classes, but now I was letting down my parents, the community leaders who selected me, and my teachers. My family did not react outwardly to my failure. My father did not show his emotions readily. But the resignation in my mother's eyes said everything about the profound disappointment they felt after focusing all the family's resources on the goal of getting me to college. Among the faculty and white students I encountered, some were friendly. A smaller number were distinctly unfriendly, but most seemed not to care one way or the other that I was black. Many had had few or no previous experiences with the black persons. Black students knew that the city of Norman had a rule that black persons were not to be in the city after sundown, and we were very careful to avoid encountering the Norman police. I spent part of the summer of 1954 working as a laborer with one of my uncles, and became determined to return to OU, find a major that I could handle, and succeed. I wanted to make my family proud of me and not be relegated to life as a laborer. Eventually, I found the right major, bacteriology, and pushed hard to get enough credits to graduate in the summer of 1957. My parents had only gone through the 8th grade, and I was very proud that they got to see me graduate from college. It meant a lot to me, and still does, that my father saw me graduate before he was killed in an industrial accident the following year. After 1953, more black students enrolled in OU, some directly from high school and others as transfer students from other colleges. Jesse and I were the only black students who entered in 1953 and graduated in 4 years. I never really thought about the significance of what we had accomplished until much later. In 2006, I was selected by OU to receive a Distinguished Alumnus Award, and at the presentation ceremony, for the first time, I felt some sense of pride in my role in the school's history. Looking back, and now, at age 83, I look back and know that I could not have accomplished what I did, going from a humble beginning on a dirt-poor sharecropper's farm to a segregated life in the city, to finally overcoming the resistance to integration in the wider world of the University of Oklahoma, without the perseverance I derived from my family. They were committed to making certain that I believed that I could overcome obstacles and accomplish great things far beyond what they had ever done. Advisors played a big role too. Our teachers were our first advisors, training, guiding, and preparing us for our life's work as responsible adults. Although my assigned advisor that first year at OU was likely a racist and wanted to keep me from succeeding, certain individuals at the university were keys to my success. None more so than Dr. Howard Larsh, chairman of the Plant Sciences Department. Dr. Larsh provided support and nurturing and helped restore my confidence and faith in my academic capabilities. I received undergraduate and graduate degrees before leaving the university in 1960. Because advisors play a key role in helping students attain success in careers and in life, serving as advisor and mentor to dozens of students over the years has been one of the most satisfying aspects of my career. This sharecropper's son eventually became a doctor of medicine, specializing in infectious diseases such as HIV/AIDS, other sexually transmitted diseases, and infections in immunocompromised patients. In 2004, I retired as a professor of medicine at the University of Washington School of Medicine and a member at the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center in Seattle. As I review these thoughts and memories of long ago, it occurs to me that each stage of my young life was necessary to shape the person I became. The pattern is almost complete now, and the pattern has meaning. Much was given so that I would be able to give back in my life as a physician, researcher, teacher, and advisor. Thank you very much.
Thank you, George. George, I would just love to ask how you're going to give this gift to your grandchildren and your children. Have you done that yet?
Oh, yes.
You have?
Oh, yes.
Oh, good. Oh, good.
Yes, it was originally published by Lifetime Learning Center in early 2019, so they have seen it.
Oh, they have seen it. Oh, good.
Right. They were astonished.
I bet so. Thank you so much, George. Yep. That was a gift to all of us, and look forward to looking at Writers Read on your TV, channel 370, Monday nights at 7. And thanks. Good to see you all.